What if the legends of beasts tearing through medieval villages weren't myths, but covered-up histories of a brutal hierarchy? Hidden in the 14th century archives of the Vatican lies the forbidden chronicle of Eleanor, Ashford, an outcast who brought an empire to its knees, guarded by a monster who crowned her queen. History books will tell you that the Yorkshire moors in the winter of 1342 were plagued by exceptionally large wolves, a menace that drove villagers behind high stone walls and locked iron gates. But recently discovered journals of a monk named Brother Thomas, sealed away for centuries by the church, reveal a far darker truth. These were not mere wolves. They were the winter-born pack, a ruthless dynasty of shapeshifters ruled by a terrifying hierarchy, and at the absolute bottom of that hierarchy was Eleanor. Eleanor Ashford was an Omega, but even that title felt like a generous exaggeration to the beasts she served. She was the daughter of Lord Reginald Ashford, a former pack elder who had attempted a failed coup against the reigning Alpha Richard Thorne. When the rebellion was crushed, Reginald was executed, and his bloodline was cursed to eternal servitude. Eleanor, barely 18, bore the sins of her father in every bruised rib and scarred shoulder. To be an Omega in the 14th century was to be a slave to the pack's primal urges. To be Eleanor, however, was a fate worse than death. Due to severe malnourishment and the trauma of her upbringing, Eleanor suffered from a condition known in the ancient texts as lupus incompletus. She could not fully shift. When the full moon dragged the beast out of the others, granting them power, speed, and euphoria, it only brought Eleanor agonizing pain. Her bones would crack and splinter. Her eyes would bleed gold, but the transformation would fail, leaving her convulsing on the icy stone floors of the scullery. The pack despised her for it. They viewed her existence as an insult to the moon goddess. Arthur Richard treated her as invisible, a ghost haunting the damp cellars of Winterbourne Keep. But the true architect of her daily torment was the pack's beta, Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was a sadistic brute, a man whose human form was just as ugly and scarred as his wolf. He took immense pleasure in reminding Eleanor of her place. The runt of the traitor, he would hiss, kicking over the heavy wooden buckets of boiling water she carried to wash the blood from the hunters' tunics. He would force her to eat the rotting scraps left over by the hounds, locking her in the freezing meat lockers if she refused. The journals of Brother Thomas describe Eleanor as frail, with skin like porcelain cracked by frost and a head of raven dark hair that she used to hide her bruised face. Yet, despite the endless cruelty, there was a quiet, unbroken defiance in her hazel eyes. She didn't weep when Arthur struck her. She didn't beg when she was thrown into the snow. She simply survived, harboring a silent, desperate hope that one day she would find a way to escape the moors entirely. But escape was impossible, especially now. The kingdom of Eifelgard was preparing for the decennial tithe. Every 10 years, the Alpha King, the sovereign ruler of all European packs, would emerge from his impenetrable fortress in the northern mountains to inspect his territories, collect taxes, and assert his dominance. The Alpha King was a figure of absolute terror and awe. His name was Callan Vance. Rumors of King Callan had bled into the human world, inspiring myths of demons and warlords. He was not a mere werewolf. He was a lycan, an ancient bloodline, larger, faster, and infinitely more lethal than any standard shifter. It was said that he had ripped the head off the French Alpha with his bare hands during a border dispute, and that his roar could shatter stone. For over a century, the Vance bloodline had ruled with an iron, unforgiving fist. Callan was known to be a cold, calculating monarch who had never taken a mate, viewing attachments as a mortal weakness. As the first snows of December began to bury Winterbourne Keep, the pack fell into a frantic panic. Alpha Richard was desperate to impress the king, demanding absolute perfection. The keep was scrubbed clean, the cellars were stocked with the finest meats and ales, and the lowest members of the pack were worked to the bone. Eleanor was tasked with scrubbing the grand hall's massive cobblestone fireplace. her bare hands raw and bleeding from the lye soap and coarse brushes. As she scrubbed, Arthur loomed over her, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "Make sure there isn't a speck of ash, runt," Arthur sneered, casually stepping on the hem of her ragged dress. "The king is a monster. If he smells the stench of a broken, half-shifting traitor's daughter, he won't just kill you. He'll slaughter the whole pack. In fact, maybe I should just lock you in the crypts until he departs." Eleanor kept her head down, ignoring the sharp pain as Arthur's heavy leather boot pressed down on her ankle. "It will be clean, Beta Arthur," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "It better be," Arthur growled, kicking her side hard enough to bruise before walking away. Eleanor gasped, clutching her ribs. As she stared into the cold, empty fireplace, she had no idea that the arrival of the Alpha King would not bring the death Arthur promised, but a reckoning that would echo through history. The night King Callan Vance arrived, the very air in Yorkshire seemed to freeze. Brother Thomas's records state that a bizarre atmospheric pressure descended upon the valley, terrifying the local livestock and forcing human villagers to barricade their doors. It was the crushing aura of an apex predator. Winterbourne Keep was ablaze with hundreds of torches, casting flickering orange shadows across the snow. Alpha Richard, Beta Arthur, and the rest of the pack elite stood shivering in the courtyard, their heads bowed, exposing their necks in the ultimate display of submission. Eleanor was hidden away in the shadows of the servants' corridor, peering through a cracked wooden door. She watched as a massive, armored carriage pulled by 6 midnight black draft horses thundered into the courtyard. The royal guard, clad in thick furs and dark steel, flanked the carriage. When the door opened, a suffocating silence fell over the keep. King Callan stepped out. He was a colossal figure, standing well over 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to block out the moonlight. He wore a heavy cloak of dark wolf fur, the pelts of challengers who had failed to usurp him. His face was ruggedly handsome, but carved from stone, possessing sharp aristocratic features, a strong jaw, and piercing ice-blue eyes that radiated a chilling, suppressed violence. Alpha Richard dropped to one knee. "My king, Winterbourne welcomes you." Callan didn't even look at him. He simply stalked past the kneeling Alpha, his boots crunching loudly in the snow, and entered the grand hall. The feast that followed was a tense, suffocating affair. The king sat at the head of the massive oak table, eating little and speaking less. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, spiced wine, and the underlying pheromones of absolute terror from the Winterbourne wolves. Eleanor was tasked with refilling the wine goblets. She had been strictly ordered by Arthur to remain invisible, to keep her head down, and to never, under any circumstances, make eye contact with the king. She moved like a phantom, her tattered woolen dress sweeping silently across the stone floor. She poured the dark red wine with trembling hands, desperate to finish her task and retreat to the safety of the cellars. She was approaching the high table, carrying a heavy silver pitcher of wine, when disaster struck. Another servant, a young Omega boy, tripped over a hound that had wandered into the hall. He stumbled backward, colliding violently with Eleanor. The heavy silver pitcher slipped from her bruised, numb fingers. It hit the stone floor with a deafening crash, the dark wine splashing violently across the boots of Beta Arthur, who was sitting just to the right of the king. The music stopped abruptly. The entire hall went dead silent. Eleanor froze, the blood draining from her face. She immediately dropped to her knees, her hands scrambling to gather the broken shards of the pitcher, her breathing frantic. Forgive me," she chanted in a breathless whisper, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Arthur's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The embarrassment of having his boots soiled in front of the king by the pack's most pathetic outcast snapped his fragile temper. "You worthless, clumsy bitch," Arthur roared, completely forgetting himself in the presence of the monarch. He stood up, his chair violently scraping against the stone. Before Eleanor could even flinch, Arthur's heavy backhand struck her across the face. The force of the blow sent her flying backward. She hit the stone floor hard, a sickening crack echoing through the silent hall as her cheekbones split. Eleanor curled into a ball, gasping in pain, tasting the metallic tang of copper as warm blood poured from her cheek and lip, dripping onto the cold stone. Arthur wasn't finished. "I warned you," he snarled, stepping toward her, his hand reaching for the heavy leather whip coiled at his belt. "I will flay the skin from your back for this insult." He raised his arm to strike her again, but the blow never landed. A sound ripped through the grand hall, a low, vibrating growl that didn't just rattle the windows, it vibrated in the teeth and bones of every wolf present. It was a sound of primal, earth-shattering dominance. At the head of the table, King Callan Vance had frozen. His ice-blue eyes were no longer cold. They were blown wide, his pupils dilated so far his eyes looked almost entirely black. The scent of spilled wine had been masked by something else, a scent that hit the king's highly tuned Lycan senses like a physical blow. It was the scent of rain-soaked pine, vanilla, and sweet, intoxicating copper. It was the scent of her blood, mate. The realization crashed into Callan's ancient soul, breaking centuries of ironclad control in a fraction of a second. The legendary Alpha King, the cold monarch who felt nothing, suddenly felt everything. And the woman who smelled like his very soul was bleeding on the floor, cowering beneath the raised hand of a low-born beta. Arthur, blinded by rage, brought the whip down. In a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, the heavy oak table splintered as Callan vaulted over it. Before the whip could touch Eleanor, a massive hand encased in hardened muscle and popping veins clamped around Arthur's throat. The momentum carried them both. Callan slammed Arthur into the heavy stone pillar of the hall with such devastating force that the stone cracked, a web of fissures spreading upward. Arthur dropped the whip, his eyes bulging in sudden, blinding terror as his feet dangled 2 feet off the ground. My king. Arthur choked out, his hands desperately clawing at the thick, tree-trunk arm holding him up. Callan didn't look at him. The king's chest heaved, a monstrous, vibrating snarl tearing from his throat. His black eyes slowly lowered, locking onto Eleanor, who was staring up at him in absolute shock, a trembling hand pressing against her bleeding cheek. When Callan spoke, his voice was a deep, demonic rumble that seemed to echo from the pits of hell itself. It was a command that would be written into the secret annals of their kind forever. Touch her and die. Alpha Richard leaped from his seat, panic seizing him. Your Majesty, she is but a worthless Omega. A traitor's runt. He was merely disciplining. Callan's head snapped toward Richard, his fangs fully descended, glowing with lethal intent. With a sickening crunch, Callan tightened his grip. Arthur's neck snapped instantly. The beta's body went limp and Callan discarded him like a piece of trash, dropping the massive corpse to the stone floor with a heavy thud. The grand hall erupted into chaos, wolves scrambling backward, terrified that the king was about to slaughter them all. But Callan ignored them. He slowly dropped to one knee before the terrified, bleeding Omega. Eleanor shrank back, her breath hitching as the giant, terrifying Lycan loomed over her. She expected death. She expected him to finish what Arthur started. Instead, Callan reached out with a hand large enough to crush her skull, and with agonizing gentleness, he cupped her uninjured cheek. His thumb softly wiped away the blood from her lip. The moment his skin touched hers, a jolt of electricity sparked between them, a warmth that Eleanor had never felt in her entire miserable life. Mine, the Alpha King whispered, the word laced with a desperate, terrifying devotion. He looked up, his black eyes sweeping over the trembling, winter-born pack. She is your queen, and I will burn this kingdom to ashes before I let another drop of her blood touch this floor. The silence that followed the snap of Arthur's neck was absolute. Within the stone walls of Winterbourne Keep, the air grew so thick with the Alpha King's murderous intent that several younger wolves fainted from the sheer atmospheric pressure. King Callan Vance, a warlord who had conquered the continent, knelt in a pool of spilled wine and blood, carefully cradling the face of a bruised servant girl. "My king," Alpha Richard stammered, his voice trembling as he stared at his dead beta. She is deformed. She carries the lupus incompletus. She cannot shift. The moon goddess has cursed her bloodline. You cannot mean to take her as your mate." Callan slowly rose to his full, towering height, positioning his massive frame between Eleanor and the rest of the pack. His ice-blue eyes snapped to Richard. "You speak of the moon goddess to me, Richard." Callan's voice was a lethal, vibrating baritone. "You, who have allowed my destined mate to be starved, beaten, and dressed in rags. You, who let a lowly beta raise a hand to your queen." Before Richard could take a defensive stance, Callan moved. He grabbed the Alpha of Winterbourne by the throat and slammed him onto the splintered remains of the great oak table. The royal guards instantly drew their steel swords, the unmistakable ring of metal echoing through the hall, but Callan raised a single hand to halt them. He wanted Richard for himself. "I should tear your heart from your chest and feed it to the hounds," Callan snarled, his claws digging into Richard's flesh. "But I will leave you alive to bear witness. Winterbourne is stripped of its royal tithe. You are no longer an Alpha recognized by the crown. Your lands belong to me. If I hear even a whisper of rebellion from the Yorkshire moors, I will return and wipe your entire bloodline from the chronicles of history. Do you understand?" Richard, gasping for air, nodded frantically. Callan dropped him, turning his back on the disgraced pack leader. He stepped back to Eleanor, who was shivering violently on the floor. Without a word, the terrifying lichen monarch unclasped his heavy royal cloak made of legendary dark wolf, pelt and draped it over Eleanor's frail shoulders. The cloak was so large it swallowed her entirely, enveloping her in the rich, intoxicating scent of pine and rain. "Gather her belongings," Callan ordered his captain of the guard, a scarred warrior named Valerius. Eleanor found her voice, though it was nothing more than a hoarse whisper. I have nothing, Your Majesty. Just the clothes on my back." The admission seemed to strike Callan like a physical blow. The muscles in his jaw ticked, and a fresh wave of sorrow and rage washed through his bond with her. "You have a kingdom now, little one," he murmured softly. He scooped her into his arms as effortlessly as one might lift a feather. Eleanor flinched, instinctively bracing for a blow that never came. Instead, she was pressed against the warm, solid expanse of his chest, surrounded by an overwhelming sense of safety she had never known. Historical records found in the secret archives of Pope Clement VI detail the sudden, mysterious departure of the Beast King from Yorkshire that very night. Brother Thomas wrote, "The demon of the north took the broken Ashford girl, riding into the freezing tempest, as if the storm itself parted for him." The journey north to the lichen stronghold of Cairn Cross was a revelation for Eleanor. Inside the opulent, fur-lined royal carriage, Callan summoned his personal physician, a wizened elder named Maester Olin. As Olin tended to her split cheek and bruised ribs, Callan sat across from her, his intense, brooding gaze never leaving her face. "Why did they treat you so?" Callan asked, his voice strained with the effort to keep his roaring beast in check. "My father was a traitor," Eleanor whispered, looking down at her scarred hands. "And I am broken. When the moon calls, I cannot answer. My bones crack, my mind shatters, but the wolf never comes. I am an abomination." Maester Olin paused his work, gently tracing the abnormally dense bone structure of Eleanor's spine. The old healer's eyes widened, darting to the king. "Sire, this is not lupus incompletus," Olin breathed, his hands trembling. "Her bones are not failing to shift because they are weak. They're resisting the shift because the vessel is attempting to contain too much power. This density, this residual magic. I have only read of this in the lost texts of the First Era. Callan leaned forward, the carriage suddenly feeling incredibly small. "Speak plainly, Olin. She is not an Omega," Olin said, staring at Eleanor with a mixture of reverence and awe. Her father, Lord Reginald, he did not rebel against Richard for power. He rebelled to protect her. She carries the dormant bloodline of the Winter Sovereigns. The White Lycans. They required an immense catalyst to trigger their first shift, usually the presence of a true Lycan mate, or a matter of absolute life and death. The agony she felt was her inner beast, trapped, waiting for the king to awaken it. Eleanor stared at the healer, her mind spinning. She wasn't broken. She wasn't a cursed Omega. Callan reached across the carriage, taking her small, scarred hand in his massive one. "No more cages, Eleanor," he vowed. "No more pain. When the next moon rises, I will stand by your side. You will finally run free, but freedom, as history often proves, must be paid for in blood." News of the Alpha King claiming a supposedly defective Omega as his queen spread across the continent like a plague. To the ancient, proud Lycan courts it was a profound insult. To Alpha Risted Dawn, stripped of his lands and titles, it was an opportunity for vengeance. While Callan and Eleanor settled into the towering stone fortress of Cairn Cross, Richard secretly allied with a faction of rogue packs from the southern territories. More dangerously, he sought out Flemish mercenaries, human monster hunters who possessed something lethal to even the strongest shifter: refined silver weaponry and concentrated wolfsbane. The attack came on the night of the blood moon, the first full moon of the new year. Eleanor was in the royal chambers, dressed no longer in rags but in an elegant gown of dark crimson velvet. The bruising on her face had faded, replaced by a radiant, healthy glow. The mate bond with Callan had accelerated her healing, flooding her veins with a strange, thrumming energy. She stood on the balcony watching Callan in the courtyard below as he prepared the perimeter guards. Suddenly the night erupted in fire and agony. A massive explosion shattered the iron gates of Cairn Cross. Flaming pitch and arrows laced with silver rained down upon the fortress. The deafening roar of hundreds of rogue wolves echoed through the mountains. Richard Thorne had arrived, leading a siege force that heavily outnumbered the king's royal guard. "Eleanor! Eleanor!" Callan's roar shook the very foundations of the keep. He shifted instantly, tearing through his armor to become a colossal, terrifying beast of midnight fur and razor-sharp claws. He carved a bloody path through the invading rogues, desperately trying to reach the stairs to her tower. Eleanor watched in horror as silver-tipped ballista bolts slammed into the stone walls. She ran toward the heavy oak doors of her chamber, intending to flee to the inner sanctum, but the doors burst open before she could reach them. Alpha Richard stood in the doorway, his human form covered in the blood of the king's guard. He held a heavy crossbow, the silver bolt gleaming in the moonlight. Behind him stood a dozen rogue wolves, snarling and snapping their jaws. "Did you really think you could escape your place, runt?" Richard spat, his eyes wild with madness. "The king is currently choking on wolfsbane gas in the courtyard below. Once I put this silver bolt through your heart, the bond will snap, and the great Callan Vance will die of a broken soul." Eleanor backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was cornered. She could hear the agonizing roars of her mate echoing from the courtyard. Callan was fighting, bleeding, dying for her. The thought of losing the only person who had ever looked at her with love, the only person who had ever protected her, ignited something ancient and terrible deep within her chest. Through the shattered stained glass window, the crimson light of the blood moon washed over her. The pain hit her, the familiar, agonizing cracking of her bones. She fell to her knees, screaming. "Look at the pathetic Omega," Richard mocked, raising the crossbow. Dying as she lived, broken. But the pain didn't stop at the breaking point this time. The presence of her mate's bond, combined with the desperate, primal need to protect him, shattered the dam that had held her back for 18 years. The cracking of her bones was suddenly drowned out by a deafening, ethereal howl that seemed to freeze the very air in the room. The rogue wolves behind Richard whimpered, taking an involuntary step back. Eleanor's screams morphed into a terrifying, deep-chested growl. Her flesh tore and reformed, her spine elongating, her muscles expanding with explosive, terrifying density. When Richard finally pulled the trigger, the silver bolt didn't strike a frail girl. It shattered harmlessly against a chest of armor-plated muscle covered in blinding snow-white fur. The beast that stood before Richard was impossible. It was a lichen, and not just any lichen, a winter sovereign. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, her brilliant white coat shimmering with a strange luminescent frost under the moonlight. Her hazel eyes had transformed into glowing orbs of molten gold. Eleanor had not just shifted, she had ascended. Richard dropped the crossbow, his jaw going slack in absolute terror. No, it cannot be. The White Queen did not hesitate. With a burst of speed that defied physics, Eleanor crossed the room. Her massive razor-sharp claws swiped through the air, completely decapitating Alpha Richard in a single, fluid motion. The traitor's head rolled across the stone floor, his expression frozen in eternal horror. The rogue wolves in the corridor immediately dropped to their bellies, exposing their throats, whining in total, paralyzing submission to the ancient, apex predator standing before them. Eleanor didn't spare them a glance. She leaped through the shattered balcony window, plummeting 100 feet into the courtyard below. She landed with an earth-shaking crash, right beside King Callan, who was covered in silver burns and surrounded by heavily armed mercenaries. When the mercenaries saw the giant white lichen land beside the Black Demon King, their morale broke instantly. Eleanor let out a roar that triggered an avalanche in the distant peaks. Together, the Black King and the White Queen tore through the remaining rebel forces, a devastating dance of midnight and snow. The rebellion was crushed in less than an hour. Later that night, as the fires burned down and the surviving rogues were chained in the dungeons, Callan found Eleanor in the royal gardens. She had shifted back to her human form, draped in his dark cloak, staring up at the blood moon. Callan, still covered in the blood of his enemies, approached her slowly, dropping to one knee before her, a king bowing to his equal. "You are magnificent," he whispered, pressing his forehead to her hand. Eleanor smiled, the scars of her past feeling like distant memories. She was no longer the weakest Omega. She was the Winter Sovereign, the true queen of Ethelgard, and the only woman who held the heart of the most dangerous creature to ever walk the earth. The records in the Vatican say the Vance dynasty ruled for 1,000 years of uninterrupted peace, all because an Alpha King saw the worth in a broken girl, and a broken girl found the strength to become a legend. If you love this story of hidden power, ancient bloodlines, and the love that defied an empire, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a good revenge plot, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another epic tale from our channel.